Daf Yud Ches Amud Beis will begin 5 lines from the top at the 2 dots. We learned in the Mishnah that if a person says that he makes an adava for wood, if a person says he's making a adava for eitzim, he should not bring less than 2 logs. Gemara says Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Bon Omar, he says Rabbi bar Malboy, he said that he asked if they would agree that Omar Harei Alai eitz. The Mishnah says Harei Alai eitzim in the plural. But what happens if a person says Harei Alai eitz in the singular? Maybe Gezer Echad. He brings only 1 log. So he said if they asked if they would agree with that if he says it in the singular, that he only brings 1 log. Amar Lazar, he said, Maslis and Amar Kain, you can bring a proof from the Mishnah. It says Shazeh Korban V'Yatzu Zeh Korban V'Yatzu, because we see from the Mishnah that each one is a separate korban. How do we see that? Gehai the Tanin Tamin, like we learned in the Mishnah. Shnei Shnaim Biyaram Shnei Gzireitz. It says that to Kahanim they have 2 blocks of wood that they bring to the Mizbeach. So the Mishnah Yomi said that that's what they bring this to Kohanim. So each one is carrying a log. So therefore, each one is carrying a log. Each one has a separate kohen to carry 1 log. Therefore, we see that each log is a separate nedova. So each one is a separate korban. Therefore, when a person says he makes an nedova to bring eitz, and eitz is considered to be a korban, therefore he can bring even 1. He says in the singular, 1 is considered to be a korban, and therefore he can bring even 1. How do we know that you can make an adova to bring eitzim for the mizbeach? So how do we know that a person can bring an adova to bring a korban? How do we know that that's something also that it's an adova that can be brought? Because korban. The pasuk says korban. The pasuk says v'nefesh kisakrev korban minchal Hashem. Now it doesn't have to say the word korban. It could have said minchal Hashem. Why does it say korban? L'Rabba says ha'etzim. It's to be marba. It's to be marba. Other things that you bring on the mizbeach, that you put on the mizbeach, that's also considered to be a korban. Therefore, it is marba, and it's marba that wood. We find that wood is called a korban. It says, the pasuk in the Nehemiah says, "V'hagayrola yisipalo al korban ha'etzim." It's called an korban ha'etzim. So therefore, in nefesh kisakrev, you can be makriv. You can bring an adova that, just like you bring an adova for a mincha, you can be makriv. You can make an adova to bring other things that also are brought on the mizbeach and are called a korban. Also, this is also included in the nadava. So a person makes an adava to bring eitzim. He brings 2 logs. Eitz is perhaps 1 log. What are the dimensions of the wood? How big is that log of wood? Rav Shua ben Levi Amar says, the thickness is amma b'ama sechekes, with a large amma, meaning an amma that's comprised of 6 tvachim. V'arkan, and the length is b'ama geduma, with a short amma. The length is a short amma of only 5 tvachim. That's one opinion. But Rabbi Chaim b'Shem Rabbi Hame says, Kimin to a tani. He says, no, the thickness was like the thickness of a stick that you hang the scales on, meaning it was a minimal thickness. The thickness did not have to be that thickness of an amma. Amar Rav Shmuel Rabbi Yitzchak. Why do we say that the length was a shortened amma, an amma of only 5 tvachim, and the fish because the place of the ma'arocha, where the pyre where he was burned, was only an amma al-amma. Therefore, you had to have a shortened amma so that it could fit over there. Because if it was only an amma al-amma square, you couldn't put something which is the length of an amma in an area that had a length of an amma. It wouldn't fit. That's why it was a shortened amma of only 5 tvachim. Betanikin, and we learned this way that we see that the ma'arocha was only an amma by amma, because we learned amma yisod. The mizbeach had a amma of yisod, the foundation that it laid on had an amma. There was an amma around it, around the foundation, and that's where you did the shvichas adonim. There was an amma of the Soid, amma Soivev, an amma of the ledge, amma Karkov, and an amma of a Karkov. And so that was the walkway, v'ama kronais, v'ama marach. Now, the Mizbeach was 5 by 5. So the top of the Mizbeach was 5 by 5. If you had the kronais, you had on each end of it, you had the corners. You had the corners, the kronais, the protruding blocks that were on each end, on all the four corners. Well, if you have a Karen here, and another Karen here and here, this is an amma. Each Karen is an amma by amma. So this takes up a space of an amma on the area of the Mizbeach, on the length, and it takes off an amma, and an amma on this side as well. So if you reduce an amma on each side, you can't have a walkway between the corners. The corners were obstructed. So the walkway, the karkayev has to be past the kronos. So you have a corner on each side. The walkway was within that. So if you take off an amma of the width or the length on this side and an amma on this side, that means you're taking an amma on each side. That means you're reducing the 5 ammas by an amma on each side. You're left with only 3. Then if you have the karka, you have the walkway, which is a strip of an amma all around the Mizbeach. So you're taking also off an amma on each side. So now from the 3, you're taking an amma off on one side, an amma on the other side. So you're left with only a square in the middle of an amma by amma. You're starting off with 5, a surface of 5. Now, after you take off the surface of 5, you take off an amma on this end for the Karen on this end, an amma on this end for the Karen on this end, and similarly on this side as well. So therefore, you now have an area of only 3 by 3. When you take a walkway of an amma all around, you're also taking off a strip of an amma on each side. You're taking off a strip of an amma on each side. So you're only left with a middle of an amma by an amma. And that was the whole area of the Mizbeach. So, for instance, if you have a square here and a square here, so that reduces the surface by an amma on this side and amma on this side. You have a walkway all around. It also reduces. So the area of the Maracha was only an amma by an amma in the middle of the Mizbeach, was an amma by amma. And therefore, you couldn't put a log that had a length of an amma in an area that was only an amma long. Levaina, how do I know? Levaina, it says, La yifchais mikaimis. You should not bring less than a kaimis, a fistful of the levaina. How do I know that? It says in levaina that when you bring the lechem upon him, the 12 loaves of lechem that are on Mizbeach from week to week, is you bring with it the levaina, and it's called an Azkara memorial. Whenever Lahalan Azkara, it says the Gabi, the Karban Mincha. It also says Azkara. It says there as well that it's an Azkara. So it says by the Lechem upon him, it comes Misham Alei Kumsa, Misalsa Mishmana, and it says, the Hemshech the Pasha says, and the Hikra Koina says Azkara Samizbecha. So it says an Azkara. And it says Lagabi the Karban Mincha. It says also an Askara. It also says an Askara. So ma an Askara Amur La'ala Malay Kaim. It's just like by the Karban Mincha. What do you mark there on the Mizbeach? What is the Askara? It's a Malay Kaim. It's a fistful. Af Askara Amur Khan Malay Kaim. So here also Lagabi Lavaina. It's a Malay Kaim. So therefore, you have 2 arrangements of the Lechem upon him. And you have 2 bazichim of levaina, and each one there's a kaimes for each one of the bazichim. So, but if you're learning out from the lechem upon him, there is 2 kumsim, because there is 2 bazichim and 2 sedorim and 2 bazichim and 2 kaimsin, and therefore there was 2. So maybe you should say also over here, Avkan Shnei Kumsim. If a person makes an adava for Levaina, if we're learning out from Lechem upon him, maybe it's not enough to bring 1 kaimes, you have to bring 2 fistfuls. Amar Ravila, he says, Klum Lamadan Lekaimes, Elam Lechem upon him, Umiminchas Chayta. Now we learn out from the lechem upon him, which in turn is learned out and from the minchas choite. And malal on kaimetz achas apostle, just like there, just as far in regard to the minchas choite, if it's missing, if it's a kaimetz that's deficient, it's missing, it's possible. Avkan kaimetz achas apostle. See here also is kaimetz v'chaser is possible. It has to be a full one. Now, what do we see? That each kaimetz is a korban by itself. And now the lechem upon him, you need to correct it. So you need to, because over there you have two korbanos. It's over there. There's because you have two sedorim, and therefore you have to bring a kaimetz with each one. You have to choose. So each one is a kaimetz, but each one on its own, a kaimetz on its own, is a korban. So here, when a person is making an adova for levina, one kaimetz is sufficient. He says, he says, if you make an adova to bring a levina, you bring up the kumsa shel kain, and the gerson abrax is gadol. Meaning, what is the size? The kaimetz is a fistful. A fistful, whose fistful? The size of what fist? So he says the kain, the biggest kain, the kain that has the largest fist that was doing the avoid on that day, you have to bring the size of his kaimetz. Rabbi Chizkiah b'shem Rabbi Yirmiyah, he argues. He says, no, it doesn't have to be the size of the kaimetz of the kain. He says, v'afilu b'kaimetz habalim. He argues that it says it can be even the size of the kaimetz of the owner. Since we are not learning directly out from the lechem upon him, we're learning out from the mincha, which is learned out from the lechem upon, but we're learning out from the case of the mincha. Now the mincha, there was no goyrel from the case of the mincha. The Baalim can designate it to whichever kain he wants. So then, in effect, it is totally on the discretion and the decision of the Baalim. So therefore, you can use the kaimetz the size of the fistful of the Baalim. Zav, he says, if he's bringing a gold, he's making a dova to bring gold. The Mishnah says, La yifchais, he should not bring less than a dinar zav. Omar, Rabbi Elazar, he says, V'hu she'ezkir tzura. Where do we say it has to be a dinar zav? That's when he mentions a coin in his dova. Avlim loy ezkir tzura, but he didn't mention a coin. Maybe afilot sinaira, he can bring even the amount of a fork, the utensil of a fork, which is the smallest of the klishoras, even that minimal amount would be sufficient. Shisha l'nedovim, then there were six shofras for nedova. Why six? Why were there six? Chizkiah Omar, he says, keneged shisha balteyavis. He says, they were keneged the 6 balteyavis. Every week there was a different mishmar of Kahanim. The Kahanim were divided into 24 mishmaras, so they rotated. Every week there was a different mishmar of Kahanim, and they in turn were divided into 6 Batei Avos, and each day of the week, excluding Shabbos, each day of the week there was a separate Beis Av that did the Avodah. On Shabbos they all did, but during the days of the week there was a separate Beis Av. He says that the donations were given, they were listed 6 separate Batei Avos. The person made the donation, made the Nadova, he put it in different ones, each one of the different shofras, keneged, correspond to the Beis Av, so that there should be no machlokes that how to divide it. The money went specifically to a particular Beis Av, and therefore that Beis Av had the donations from that shofar, so that there shouldn't be a machlokes how to divide it up. That's what he says in Bar Pedaya Omar. He says it different. He says keneged sheish behemoth. He says it was corresponding to the separate korbanos, the separate animals which were used for the korbanos. Par ve'egel, the bull and the calf, the soyer, the goat, ayel, the ram, gedi, the kid, and vitla, and the lamb. So he says when a person made an adava, then the benada for a specific animal as well. What type of korban should it go for? What a korban that you're going to be makar, is it for a par, or is it an egel, or is it a goat, is it a lamb? So he would make part of his nadava, he would put it into a specific shofar, specifically related to the type of animal that would be brought for the korban. Shmuel Amar keneged shisha korbanos. Shmuel says corresponding to the 6 korbanos, which are the zovim, the pair of birds for the zovim, and the zovos, and the Chatois, Hashamis, and the Mincha, and the Asir Zeif of the Kohen Gadol. Now, in all of these cases, what are we referring to over here? We're referring to Chatois and Hashamis, etc. They're not the Dovids, these are Chayvas, meaning that the surplus, the excess money that was used was designated for a chatos if they had extra money, or an asham v'chulei. They had the surplus money. The surplus money was used for an adava, and that surplus money was used for an adava, and they were makra korban oila, the basar l'shem, and the oils to the kahanim. This surplus would have to, depending which korban it came for, it would be designated separately. The surplus of a chatos had a separate shayfer that this came from the chatos, that it should be directed as the surplus money from a chatas or from an asham, etc. It would be identified specifically. Amar Rav Yochanan al Yadei Shehanadavam Ruba. He says a different shad. He says that it was a practical matter. Al Yadei Shehanadavam Ruba Ribula Shefer as Harbe. He said there was much money, there was a huge quantity of money that was given for nadavas. People used to bring nadavas. There, especially in those days, the money would get eroded. In those days, the minting, it wasn't the highest quality, so the money would get eroded. If it would be a huge amount of money, a large quantity of money in one chest, in one shayfer, then it would start to corrode, and it would get ruined. And therefore they divided it up into 6 separate shayfers so that there should be more airspace and it shouldn't be packed so densely and so tightly so that the money would not get ruined. So we mentioned about the drosha of Yehoyada Kohen, when they finished the renovations for the Beis Hamikdash, they brought before the king and Yehoyada the remaining money, and he used it for klishoras. So it says that they took their money and they used it for klishoras. Now there seems to be a discrepancy, because one pasuk says Vayikach Yehoyada Kohen Aron Echad V'Yikav Chor B'Dalta V'Yidanoy Seisel Mizbeach Miyamin, and he put it on the right side of the mizbeach. And then another pasuk says Vayomer HaMelech V'Yasu Aron Echad V'Yidanoy B'Shar Beis Hashem Chutza, and they put it B'Shar Beis Hashem Chutza. So, which was in a different location, was not by the Aron, was outside. So, therefore, he says, Shtei Nedavos also. He had 2 different types of donations. He said there was 2 separate ones. But Tani the Bey of Rabbi Shmuel, he says, no, Nedava Achas. It was only one. D'chsiv Vayomer Melch Ve'asu Aron Echad. It says Aron Echad. And V'Snadu B'Hechel Beis Hashem V'Yikav Chor B'Daltei. So how can it be only one? It says Vayomer HaMelech V'Yasu Aron Echad V'Yidanoy B'Shar Beis Hashem Chutza. That it says that they put it on the Shar Hashem Chutza outside, which seems to be that there was a separate place. There was a different place for it. Amar Rav Huna, he answers. He says meaning initially it was only one. It was only one Dovid. That's what he holds, not 2 separate ones. He says it was only one. Now, originally it was by the Aron Hashem, but then because the Talmud people couldn't donate, because they couldn't come in, they couldn't donate, so therefore, that's why it says that the king said, no, take it and move it outside so that the Tameim could also donate. But Rav Huna b'Shem Rabbi Yosef, he says no, he agrees with the first opinion. He says no, there were 2 separate donations, because the pasuk says Ach lo ya'aseh Beis Hashem Sipas Kesem Zamros. It says that they did not make for the Beis Hamikdash, they did not make the musical instruments, the basins, etc. They did not make klishoras. Now we learned before that some of the donations were used for klishoras. It says this pasuk says all the money was used for the wages for the workmen, and it was used for the Bedek Habayis, for the restoring of the Beis Hamikdash, the renovation, but it was not used for klishoras. The other pasuk says it must be therefore that there were 2 donations. 100 lach shleish asar shayfers, 100 lach shleish asar shayfers, 100 lach shleish asar shayfers. Mois shenimsa ben eshkolin and adova karl eshkolin.